No one grows old in this cemetery. Emily returned to her mother's hometown in rural Vermont to pay respects at her family's grave. But when she visited the local cemetery shrouded in fog and silence, she discovered something truly chilling. The gravekeeper was the same man who had buried her grandmother over 60 years ago, and he hadn't aged a day. His face matched an old black and white photo she found in the town library. Every night he walked between the headstones, whispering softly to the graves like he was having full conversations with the dead. No one knew where he lived. No one even remembered hiring him. This is one of those true horror stories that echo across generations, told in whispers, found on Reddit, and recited in low voices on Let's Read podcasts. A blend of creepy stories, true creepy stories, and scary horror stories that'll make you think twice before visiting a cemetery at dusk. Proceed only if you dare, because the truth might already know your name. Emily didn't sleep the first night. She stayed in the guest room of her aunt's weathered farmhouse in Bennington, Vermont, just a few miles from where her grandmother had been buried over 6 decades ago. But sleep wouldn't come, because she couldn't stop thinking about the man in the cemetery, the gravekeeper, the one who hadn't aged since 1961. The next morning, Emily walked back to the cemetery. Fog still clung to the tree line like something alive, cold, quiet, and unmoving. She passed the old iron gate, its hinges creaking like they hadn't been oiled in years. And yet it was clean, no rust, no decay. The headstones looked older than they had yesterday, more weathered. She made her way to her grandmother's grave. The gravekeeper was already there. He was kneeling, speaking in a low tone as if in prayer or conversation. Emily stepped closer, expecting him to stop, but he didn't. He only looked up when she was a few feet away. "Your grandmother asked about you," he said. Emily froze. "Excuse me?" He stood slowly, his face still smooth, still impossibly youthful, the same exact face she had seen in the yellowed newspaper at the town library. "She said you'd come soon, that you'd want answers." Emily's breath caught in her throat. This couldn't be real. This was one of those true creepy stories you hear on Reddit or late-night Let's Read podcasts. Scary stories about people who never die, who speak to the dead, who live in places forgotten by time. She should have turned and run, but something held her. "I remember burying your grandmother," he said, his voice distant. "December 3rd, 1961. Snowstorm that year. We had to carry the casket by foot." Emily wanted to believe he was just eccentric, maybe mentally ill, maybe playing some creepy local role like a tour guide. But the way he spoke, the accuracy, the weight behind his words, it chilled her to her core. She found herself asking, "How old are you?" He smiled but didn't answer, only said, "Come back tonight if you want the truth." She did. Of course she did, because what else could she do? The pull was too strong. That night the cemetery changed. It didn't just feel old, it felt ancient. The fog didn't roll in. It stood still like a wall, and Emily saw the gravekeeper again standing beside her grandmother's headstone. Only now he wasn't alone. He stood in a circle of lanterns, and beside him were others. Figures in old clothing, faded suits, tattered dresses. They didn't move, but they watched. Emily recognized one of them. It was a woman from a portrait in her aunt's living room, her great-great-grandmother. The gravekeeper stepped forward. "They wait for me," he said. "They speak, but not with voices, not like you and I." He gestured to the lanterns. "Each one holds a name, a life, a memory." Emily trembled. "This cemetery was built on old ground," he said. "Before towns, before roads, before names, and some stories, they don't end. They echo." The rest of the night was a blur. Whispers, old voices, shadows that moved where light should not. She saw visions, flashes of other places, national park stories where rangers vanished without trace. campsites where no one returned, forests that rearranged their trees overnight, wilderness stories stitched into headstones, true horror stories branded into bone, and always the gravekeeper at the center of it all. Emily left the cemetery just before sunrise, but something had followed her. She began hearing her name when no one was near. Dreams of the gravekeeper's voice, of the lanterns lighting one by one, and then she received a letter. No stamp, no return address. Inside a photo, her, standing in the cemetery from the night before. Except in the photo, she was standing in the gravekeeper's place, and all the lanterns were lit. Emily tried to leave Bennington. She packed her car and drove west toward Albany, but 20 minutes into the highway, her GPS glitched. Then her phone screen went black. When she looked back up, the same cemetery gate stood in front of her. Not a detour, not a trick of memory. She had driven in a straight line, yet somehow ended up back at the cemetery. Her hands trembled. The name on the gate now engraved deeper than before: Whisper Hill Memorial Grounds, keeper of forgotten stories. She turned the car off and walked in. That night, the gravekeeper was waiting. He no longer stood beside her grandmother's grave, but at the center of the old burial field, a stone circle Emily had never seen before. He motioned for her to approach. As she stepped into the circle, a sudden gust of cold air whooshed past her shoulders, but nothing moved. No trees swayed, no leaves rustled. Even the fog seemed held in suspension. "You were meant to see this," he said. And then the lanterns lit themselves one by one until the circle was surrounded by a ring of golden flames. Each flame whispered, not in English, not in words, but in memories. Flashes of hikers losing their way in the Appalachian Mountains, of park rangers who never returned from their patrols, of campers who spoke of strange lights and missing time. Emily saw them all in a blur, like she was being pulled into hundreds of wilderness stories, each one more terrifying than the last. "You're not the first," the gravekeeper said, "but you may be the last." Emily stared at him. He didn't look threatening, but she could feel it. This wasn't a man, not anymore. "What are you?" she whispered. He blinked slowly. "I am what remains when stories are no longer told. I was once a man, a ranger. I guarded trails, cabins, borders of the forgotten." His eyes darkened. "And then I listened too closely." He told her of creepy park ranger stories that never made it into official reports, of trails where compasses spun wildly, of patrol routes that changed every night, paths that didn't exist the day before, of graves found in forests where no one had died yet. "I was the last to remember," he said. "So the land chose me." Emily felt her stomach turn. "Chose you for what?" He looked at the lanterns. "To keep the truth buried." The cemetery, he explained, wasn't just a resting place. It was a threshold, a holding ground for memories that couldn't die. It collected stories, true scary stories, scary horror stories, even those whispered on Reddit threads and lost "let's not meet" posts. The more people forgot them, the more the cemetery absorbed them. "They think forgetting keeps them safe," he said, "but the stories remember." The gravekeeper motioned toward one lantern. "Listen." Emily stepped closer. Inside, a flickering image formed. A national park. Two kids on a trail, following a deer they'd seen on YouTube. The video was meant to be content, a creepy outdoor story for clicks. But it ended with one of them screaming, the camera falling, and the sound of footsteps, not human. Emily's eyes widened. She recognized the trail. It was the same one behind her aunt's house. Another lantern lit. This one showed a Let's Read podcast setup, mic, laptop, dark room. A narrator reciting a tale sent anonymously about a woman who came back to her family town and met a man who hadn't aged in 60 years. Emily gasped. It was her story, but who had sent it? "You're already part of it," he said. "You always were." Suddenly the lights dimmed, the fog rolled in again, and voices began to rise from the ground. She heard names, dates, phrases like "he was never found." They said it was a bear, but I saw the eyes. She walked into the woods, and the trees closed behind her. It was overwhelming. Thousands of true creepy stories, echoes of scary woods stories and wilderness disappearances, and all of it bound to her. Emily ran through the gravestones, past the gate, into the fields. She didn't look back, but even in her sprint, she knew the story wasn't done, because now she remembered. At home, she checked her voice messages. There was a new one, unmarked, a man's voice. "You can't run from what you are. You're the story's next keeper, Emily." And the next day, she received a package. Inside, a lantern, a map of Whisper Hill, and a small stone plaque etched with her name. No sender, no explanation, just a note. "Welcome home." Emily stopped leaving the house. She boarded up the windows, covered mirrors, disconnected the landline, but the stories still found her. They bled through static in her headphones, through offbeat rhythm in podcast ads, even in the margins of library books. They weren't just scary stories anymore. They were warnings, clues, commands. One night, while scanning the Reddit page, Our Paranormal Encounters, Emily saw a thread titled, "He looks just like my grandpa, but he never aged." The post was by a user named A Lantern Whisper. It detailed an encounter in a national park decades ago with a ranger who led hikers away from known paths, who claimed to be a historian, who always appeared near ancient graves no matter where the poster traveled. The thread had hundreds of replies, all describing similar figures, same build, same clothes, same eternally young face. Emily wasn't alone. This wasn't just her story, but her role had changed. She no longer feared the gravekeeper, she feared becoming him. That fear deepened when she started losing time. She would black out in her kitchen and wake up by the cemetery gate standing in the fog. Once she awoke with dirt under her nails and a folded note in her pocket. "You buried it. You don't remember, but the land does." She opened her closet one morning and found a park ranger uniform her size, perfectly pressed, with a name tag that read, "E. Hale." She hadn't ordered it, but she didn't throw it away. Something told her she'd need it. The emails started next. Anonymous tips, coordinates, photos. One was an old black and white image of the cemetery dated 1933. In the center stood the gravekeeper looking exactly as he did now. In his hand was a lantern, and beside him, a woman, Emily. It wasn't her exactly, but someone with her face. A perfect double. She needed answers, so she went to the only place stories never died, the Ranger Archives. At the State Historical Office in Montpelier, Vermont, she requested old Ranger files. Most were faded, but one box labeled Echo 9 was sealed in red wax. Inside were incident reports dating back to 1907, all handwritten, each describing wilderness stories no one dared speak aloud. Rangers gone missing. Cabins rebuilt again and again after mysterious fires, trails that led to nowhere then returned weeks later. Each file closed with the same words, "Story Archived," assigned to Whisper Hill. There was a pattern. Every true scary story in the box ended in that cemetery. Every ranger who knew too much vanished into it. One file mentioned a ranger named Nathan Hale, Emily's grandfather. He was reported dead in 1973, but there was no death certificate, no body, only a note attached to the file he volunteered. Lantern accepted. Emily left the archives shaken, but her decision was made. She would return to Whisper Hill, and this time she wouldn't run. That night she walked through the gates again. No fog, no whispers, just silence. She reached the center circle. The lanterns lit, one by one, but they didn't flicker yellow. They glowed deep red, and when they did, the ground split and the dead spoke. Hundreds of voices telling scary horror stories. True creepy stories, fragments of creepy park ranger stories she'd read online. We saw eyes in the trees. The stars blinked back at us. We followed the trail and walked into 1979. She said her name was Elodie, but she'd been dead 10 years. Emily dropped to her knees. The lantern spun faster. The gravekeeper stepped out from behind a mausoleum. He was no longer calm. He was terrified. "It's too late. You remembered too much." Emily stood. "No, I'm not here to forget." He nodded slowly, then listened. He handed her a book, bound in leather. Blank pages. She opened to the first one. Words began appearing, ink from nowhere. It was her story, being written as she watched. "You're the archive now," he said. Then, like fog in the morning, he vanished. At home, Emily sat at her desk. She opened her laptop, began to type. She posted her experience to Reddit under R No Sleep, then recorded it for a Let's Read narration, then again for a Let's Not Meet submission. Each post ended the same way: "I don't care if you believe me, but if a man offers you a lantern in the woods, don't take it unless you're ready to keep the stories alive." And from that day on, she wasn't alone. Other names appeared in her inbox, other accounts, other voices. One by one, the stories came, and the lanterns stayed lit. Emily's post went viral. Thousands of upvotes, dozens of podcasts featured it under true horror stories and scary stories tags. From Let's Read channels on YouTube to audio productions hosted on late-night Spotify lists, her story wasn't just told, it was consumed. But with each retelling, the lanterns flared brighter. At first, Emily thought she was keeping the memory alive. Then she realized something darker. She was feeding it. More users reached out, some anonymous, some using aliases like Last Patrol or Whisper in Pines. They didn't ask if her story was real. They sent her proof that theirs were too. One user, Out Trail Echo, described being stalked for 2 days in the Olympic National Forest by what he thought was a lost hiker until it smiled and whispered his dead sister's name. Another told a creepy outdoor story about finding a ranger tower, fully intact, lit from within, playing an old 1930s jazz song on loop, yet the Forest Service had no record of any structure at that location. Emily began mapping the stories. Colorado, Wyoming, Maine, even remote wilderness in Alaska, all pinned, all near ancient cemeteries, all near places with documented park ranger stories gone cold. And one name kept appearing in these files: Nathan Hale, her grandfather. She dug deeper. The deeper she looked, the more she realized her grandfather hadn't just vanished. He had sacrificed himself. As the stories became too many, too loud, he offered himself to the land, becoming the archive, the lantern bearer. But archives decay, and when the keeper weakens, the stories seek a new vessel, her. She remembered the ranger uniform in her closet, the name tag, the fit, the invitation. That night she dreamed of the cemetery again, but this time the graves were open, empty, and the fog rolled outward, not inward. It spilled across the land, whispering phrases like true creepy stories, wilderness stories, and scary woods stories, as if invoking power through repetition. The stories didn't want to be locked anymore. They wanted to be heard. When Emily woke, her living room wall was covered in printed pages. Pages she never printed, each one a transcript from Reddit threads, some dating back to the early 2000s. She recognized usernames she'd never seen before, and her own name in comments. She never wrote. She turned to the window. The fog had reached her porch. No one else in the town noticed. She called her aunt, no answer. The local ranger station disconnected. She stepped outside. No birds, no wind, just stillness. And in the middle of the street, a lantern, lit, with her initials carved into the base. Emily picked it up. Instantly, memories not her own surged into her skull. A boy lost in Shenandoah clutching a compass that spun. A girl in Oregon recording a vlog before the screen went black. A ranger in Yosemite hearing his own voice echoing from the trees. Dozens of true scary stories seared into her mind like brands. And one final voice, her grandfather. Don't let the silence win. She returned to Whisper Hill, but now the gate was gone. In its place stood an arch of trees, twisted like skeletal fingers lit only by the lantern in her hand. She stepped through. The ground pulsed under her feet. Roots moved. Stone moaned. The cemetery was alive and waiting. She reached the circle. All 17 lanterns were lit, except one. An empty space remained at the center, the place of the keeper, and she understood. There was no escape. There was only recording. She wasn't there to stop the stories. She was there to remember them. A voice whispered, "Read," and she did. Each lantern told a tale. One about a ranger trail that looped infinitely, trapping hikers in decades-old time loops. One about a cabin that changed location every night, but only by a few feet until it was behind someone's house. One about a creepy park ranger who guided people off safe paths and into hungry ones. Every tale burned itself into Emily's mind. She wept, but never stopped reading. Suddenly she heard laughter. Children. Behind her. She turned. 4 shadowy figures ran between graves. She followed, deeper and deeper, until she stood before a stone engraved with her own face, but aged, decayed. The epitaph read, "She remembered when no one else would," and beneath it, "Story assigned, lantern accepted." The moment Emily stood before her own grave, something in the atmosphere shifted. The air crackled not with thunder, but with voices, whispers rising from the trees, from the soil, from the fog. They weren't just echoes anymore. They were commands, chants from another realm, demanding she listen. And so she did. She knelt before the stone. Her lantern flickered not out of weakness, but in rhythm. Morse code in flame. She blinked, and she was no longer in the graveyard. Now she stood deep inside a forest, dense, unfamiliar. Pines towering above like cathedral spires. The woods pulsed and the ground throbbed beneath her boots. She reached for her lantern, now heavier, now glowing white. Ahead, a faint path wound into darkness. A carved wooden sign read, "Welcome to Echo Point," a national park of forgotten names. There were no tourists, no rangers, only her. She started walking. It was a creepy outdoor story brought to life, the kind she used to read online late at night under Reddit tags like R no sleep, R paranormal, and let's not meet. But now it was all tangible, the crunch of dead leaves underfoot, the odd animal calls that didn't match any species she knew. Her first stop was an abandoned ranger tower. Creaking steps, rusted metal. Inside a faded park ranger journal, the final entry read, "She walks now with the light. May the keeper remember us when we're gone." Flipping the pages, she found names, all familiar, all people who had shared true horror stories online and then vanished, as if the story didn't just take them, it kept them. She moved on. The deeper she ventured, the more the forest warped. Time bent around her. She heard campfire tales whispered across decades. She passed a campsite where logs still burned, though no one was near. A photo album sat open on a stump, images of families that aged, strangely skipping years in between. This wasn't just a forest, it was an archive, a living library of true scary stories and scary horror stories curated by the land itself. And she was its new librarian. In the clearing, she met the first apparition, a boy in a tattered hoodie. He clutched a broken compass. His voice shook. I followed the trail. Then the trail followed me. Emily nodded. "I know." He placed the compass in her hand. "You're the keeper now." And just like that, he was gone, replaced by another figure. A woman in ranger gear, eyes black as obsidian. "I walked this trail for 20 years, she whispered, "until it walked me." Then she too dissolved into mist. Emily continued the lantern, now burning blue. With each step, more stories surrounded her. Some were wilderness stories of hikers swallowed by fog. Others were creepy park ranger stories of patrolmen speaking in tongues of towers that blinked with red eyes at night. She passed a mirror nailed to a tree. Her reflection blinked out of sync. The image smiled before she did. Deeper still, she reached the edge of the Whispering Valley. Below her, a massive stone map engraved with all the trails lost to time. In the center, a pulsing orb of light, the archive's heart. She descended. Inside the chamber, voices screamed. Every true creepy story ever told pulsed in the air. And at the center, Nathan Hale, her grandfather, or what remained of him. His face was cracked stone-like, but his eyes were human. "Emily," he said, voice ragged, "you came farther than I ever could." She knelt. "What is this place?" He looked around. "This is where the stories sleep and where they wake," he explained. For centuries, true stories, those that defied logic, that clawed at reality, could not die. They lingered in national parks, in wilderness, in places humans couldn't tame. Rangers were the first to notice, so they built archives, not to protect people, but to protect the stories from fading, and someone had to carry them. "You can let them go," he whispered, "or carry them with honor." The lantern floated from her grip, now glowing violet. It hovered between them, her choice. Emily looked around. She saw names etched in the walls, usernames from Reddit, old audio snippets from Let's Read narrations, whispers from Let's Not Meet threads muttering phrases like, "It watched from the tree line." I woke up in the same tent but 20 years earlier. She never blinked, never aged. Every thread, every comment, alive, waiting. She stood, took the lantern, and the archive pulsed. Brighter, bigger. The chamber shattered. She awoke in her room. Desk lamp on, laptop open. A new post auto-typed on screen. Title, The Keeper's Burden. Tags, horror stories, true horror stories, creepy stories, true creepy stories. Let's read, let's not meet, park ranger stories, wilderness stories, Reddit. If you're reading this, it's because the lantern chose you. This story isn't entertainment. It's a warning. Tell it or be part of it. Emily couldn't tell if she was dreaming anymore. Time no longer unfolded in a straight line. Some nights she awoke in her apartment thinking everything that had happened was just a scary story she read online. Other nights she would jolt awake in the forest, the lantern beside her, whispering new names. The border between reality and memory was gone. She was living in the archive now. The moment she accepted the keeper's role, the forest around her began shifting, not in space, but in time. She found a trail map etched in bark dated 1892. Then a pocket watch with her name on the back ticking in reverse, and the stories began chasing her. She would hear footsteps behind her, always stopping when she turned. She saw glimpses of park rangers through the trees, rangers she recognized from Reddit threads and Let's Not Meet stories. Their faces were always familiar yet wrong, like they remembered too much and were punished for it. The deeper she went, the more the forest tried to speak. Branches formed words. Leaves rustled in phrases she knew weren't made by the wind. One night she saw her own reflection in a puddle, and it mouthed a phrase before she could. "You're not writing the stories, you're transcribing them." Emily found a journal lodged in the roots of an old oak. Its entries were signed by different hands, different decades, some in pencil, others in blood. She read, July 5th, 1951, Ranger Clive disappeared again. He always comes back, but older. Says the forest charges a toll in time. June 18th, 1974, found a campfire burning. Marshmallows still soft, no campers, just a cassette tape labeled "Play Me If It Happens to You." October 31st, 1990, saw my dead brother in uniform. He handed me a lantern. Then he whispered, "Write it down or they'll make you live it." Each entry was a fragment, a true creepy story trying to survive. Emily began writing her own. She didn't know if she was protecting the world from the stories or the stories from the world. She just knew she had to remember. One evening, as the fog wrapped tighter than usual, she saw a glow up ahead, a ranger cabin light flickering within. She entered cautiously. Inside was a young woman, maybe 19, in a soaked parka. Her hands trembled around a mug of tea. "You're Emily," the girl said, voice hollow. "I followed your story." Emily's heart thudded. From where the girl blinked. From Reddit. From No Sleep. "I thought it was a creepy story until the trail map changed." The girl, Casey, had been hiking in Glacier National Park. She stumbled upon a trail that didn't exist on any map, one lined with lanterns whispering in her dead mother's voice. "I kept walking," she said. "Then I found your post. It updated in real time. Even when I lost signal, Emily's blood ran cold." The archive wasn't just storing stories now, it was broadcasting them, feeding on readers, drawing them in. They weren't alone anymore. Dozens of others found the path. People from across the country, hikers, rangers, digital nomads, drawn in by stories from Reddit, by scary horror stories told in threads and podcasts. The archive was waking, and it was hungry. That night, a storm hit. But not of rain of stories. Pages rained from the sky, each covered in handwriting voice transcriptions, YouTube auto captions. Emily stood in the middle of the clearing, arms raised, letting them coat her skin. Each story that touched her revealed more. A ranger who vanished inside a cave where echoes never ended. A family trapped in a cabin where mirrors refused to reflect them. A hunter who found his own bones hanging from a tree. The lantern beside her flared bright green. The archive's heart was open again. Emily knew what she had to do. She gathered the pages. She walked to the stone at the center of the Whispering Valley. She placed the lantern atop it, and the ground opened, not down but outward, creating a new path, one where others could walk, one that led to every national park story, every creepy outdoor story, every true scary story that refused to be forgotten. Casey approached. "Is it safe?" Emily smiled sadly. "No, but it's true." Emily stood alone. The valley was empty now of people, but not of memory. All around her, the stories pulsed, not pages, not voices, but energy. They lived inside the rocks, inside the air, and inside her. The lantern in her hands no longer flickered. It burned steady, constant. It was no longer a light source, it was a heart. From the corner of her vision, the fog rippled, shapes emerged, familiar ones. Nathan Hale, her grandfather, stepped forward, his face no longer cracked or gray. He looked as he did in photographs from 1965. Youthful, strong. "You did it," he said quietly. "You became the keeper." Emily wanted to collapse, but she stayed standing. "What happens now?" He pointed behind her. The ground opened slowly, revealing not a hole, but a stairwell. Stone, carved with names, thousands of names, each one a storyteller, each one a witness. She stepped forward. Each stair she took, she saw fragments, true horror stories from all across the country. Some whispered phrases like, "I saw a woman walk into the lake and never come out." Others showed flickering images of creepy park ranger stories, their faces contorted, their shadows not matching their movements. She reached the final step, and there it was, the archive. It wasn't a library, it was a consciousness, a living network of every story told, shared, or remembered. Some from Reddit, some never posted, some forgotten in old cassette tapes, others etched on tree bark or whispered between generations. Emily reached forward and placed her lantern in the center. Instantly, the archive reacted. Light spread, not just through the valley, but through time, through internet threads, through YouTube narrations, through podcast episodes tagged with true scary stories. Let's read scary wood stories, wilderness stories. It fed not on fear, but on remembrance. She gasped. Because she saw herself, every version of her. In 1899, wearing a canvas ranger coat. In 1972, holding a walkie-talkie and whispering names into the void. In 2006, typing on an old forum labeled Unexplained Encounters. And in the now, eyes wide, mind open. The archive had always needed a vessel, not to contain, but to share. Voices rose from the fog, from the trees, from every stone, every lantern ever lit. They chanted, "The Keeper remembers, so the darkness forgets." And for the first time, Emily understood. These weren't horror stories, they were warnings, they were survivors. And she wasn't their prison, she was their lighthouse. Emily opened her eyes. She stood in her apartment again, the Reddit post still open. But now it had millions of views and thousands of comments. Each one a new story, each one an offering. She smiled, then began to read. If you're reading this, it means the archive found you. You're not imagining it. The forest moved, the trail looped, the light flickered. We are the keepers now, and it's your turn to remember.